The paper that I've contributed for this conference has a number of pictures in it. One of the neat things about working in the medium that I'm working in is that it's trivially easy to use the same data sets that I'm using to make the inferences that I'm making to draw really pretty pictures. And I hope to show some of them to you, but ran out of time at the end on computer transfers. So that's on me. I wanted to thank Dominique for inviting me here. I'm also want to explicitly out myself. I have a much more superficial model of Ukraine than most people in this room. And I think it's worth acknowledging that up front. I am a specialist primarily in the politics of Tajikistan and secondarily in the politics of Georgia. And what I'm really, really good at is comparing Tajikistan to Georgia. I am less good, it remains to be seen how good I am at convincing political scientists to read about a comparison between Tajikistan and Georgia. But I have been encouraged to get into the Ukraine business, and so I'm trying to get into it and doing it in a responsible way. But I am certainly not going to compete with the people who are up on this panel and many of the people in the audience in terms of my knowledge of the conflict, because I just can't play that game. I'm going to butcher a name, and I don't want to do it. So I do know a lot about counterinsurgency, and I know a lot about irregular warfare. I know a lot about the state of the art in political science on these kinds of topics, I've now outed myself as much as I can, so I might as well just make it explicit. When I look at Ukraine, what I see is Georgia. And everything that I'm about to say is filtered through that lens. I can't help it. That's just who I am. Standpoint epistemology is real. When I look at Somalia, I see Tajikistan. I just can't help it. That's who I am. Standpoint epistemology is real. So what I'm going to do with the next 8 minutes of my time is very briefly walk through the methodology that I'm using to make what inferences I am making about Ukraine. And the short one-sentence bullet on it is that everything that has been described by my co-panelists is well documented on Twitter by spontaneous activism by a decentralized group of people. And I have captured an attempt to systematically code the characteristics of a large sample of these people. It is not just Russian bots that are reproducing the data. These are people who are reproducing the data. They are telling stories, and these stories are on very different narrative tracks. What do I mean when I say narrative tracks? This is a language that I have reappropriated from a science fiction author that I like quite a bit named Neil Stephenson. And the idea, quite simply, since we already had a Tolkien and we had a Tolkien reference and J.R.R. Martin reference thrown out already, let me plug Neil Stephenson's work. The idea is that people tell themselves stories and they can't help it. They put together coherent strings of facts in order to make sense of the world. I'm not the first person to notice this. This is the basis of most religion. It's the basis of most ideology. But in order to live coherent lives and make sense of the world, we oftentimes carry around multiple mutually contradictory narrative tracks, and we just kind of pick them up and we plug them in from time to time. What's important in what is important when we discuss this phenomenon against the backdrop of violent civil war, like we're seeing in Ukraine, is when the narrative tracks emphasize different facts, and I think as was beautifully demonstrated in some of the presentations in the first panel, when these narratives are actually designed to exclude people from the coalition formation process that is taking place. So I can't reappropriate the language that was used by some of the anthropologists that were up on the panel at the beginning, but I found it quite inspiring, and I think it's basically true. So my research design is real simple. I noticed when looking at a large sample of tweets that were geocoded and I knew were coming out of Ukraine, so this isn't Americans or English speakers talking about Ukraine, which is what most Twitter studies are. This is Ukrainians talking about Ukrainian politics. I noticed that systematically the hashtag Euromaidan dialogue was a pretty good proxy for knowing whether you were on the side of the Euromaidan people or not. No one was using that hashtag or trying to propagate knowledge in that social network who was pro-regime. And so there may have been some attempts to co-opt that network, but basically, I could make inferences, and I noticed that I was making inferences based on that sampling decision. Later, when the war changed, when it became a war, I started thinking about other things that I could do that would have the same effect. And I latched onto the language of terrorism and the language of fascism. Nobody is trying to start a conversation seriously by accusing the other side of terrorism. And no one is trying to start a conversation seriously by accusing the other side of being a fascist. You can create word clouds. You can see these discourses. I go in the paper into the technical details of how I constructed the computer learning part of this. But I basically got a bunch of different dictionaries of hate speech and like pro-Kiev narrative hate speech and pro-Russian media narrative bubble hate speech, and then tracked it. And my prior was that you would see people in the East calling people in the West fascists, and that you would be able to see that track over time, and that you would see people in the West calling people in the East terrorists, and you would be able to track that over time. And I give a number of maps. It's a little bit messier of a story than that. I don't want to say that that is the only trend in the data, but yeah, that's basically what happens, right? Like that's not news to anybody in this room. I have to. I break the data down in a number of different ways in order to try to make it tractable, and the story doesn't match perfectly. But I think this has a couple of implications, and I'll talk about them briefly, and then we can move it to Q&A. The first is, it's almost too obvious to say, but it deserves to be said. We are really dealing with different narrative tracks, and we're dealing with different self-contained and internally consistent narratives of what happened, this is going to be a very, very difficult problem to solve politically in the long term. These are issues that may actually not have resolutions other than a kind of collective social forgetting, and I don't see much chance of that happening in the next couple of months or years. I think that we have very, very activated groups who genuinely remember what was at stake in these events differently, and that not only makes it difficult to speak at a forum like this without worrying about violence against your family. I'm sure that Lucan's not really worried about violence against his family, but this does get emotional for audiences in the room. I think it's just important to remember that there's a diversity of audiences out there that think differently about these issues and are going to keep thinking differently about these issues, no matter how eloquent we are up here, or no matter which facts we choose to include or like kind of leave on the cutting room floor of our essays to each other. Like we are all in the process together of trying to sculpt a hegemonic narrative. I mean, that's kind of what we do, but the future is probably going to be noisy and it's probably going to be diverse. The second thing that is worth noting, and it's less obvious, is that there's a ton of diversity within the Russian language speaking population on this topic. I kind of expected that I was going to be able to find, Russians saying one thing and Ukrainians saying the other. That is not true. Despite the obvious fact that you can track certain parts of the conflict off of Russian and Ukrainian language, there's a lot of different Russians who are a lot of different kinds of Russians living in Ukraine, or a lot of different kind of Russian speakers living in Ukraine, who believe a lot of different things. And so there are a lot of voices that are going to be excluded from whatever political settlement comes out of this, no matter what. And I think it's important to kind of keep that in mind too. Last thing, and then we can just move to Q&A, is I did something that doesn't happen very much in these kinds of studies in political science, which is that I didn't just use machine coding. I paid a bunch of Ukrainian sociology students to sit down and actually read the content of these tweets and make sure that we weren't just picking up people speaking ironically or people taking selfies of themselves and saying, "Oh, look, I'm a terrorist." We did a lot of work, actually, and it took a lot of work to make sure that that these words are predictive of the kinds of beliefs and narratives that would make for meaningful data if we were not computer scientists, but we were instead treating data like evidence in a courtroom, or the way that other disciplines use data, and we did okay. And so the machine learning algorithms, the assumptions that we made at the beginning when it was just computers talking to other computers, it predicted correctly 2/3 of the time. Like terrorism is a discourse that gets, both sides, particularly in Donbass, use terrorism to describe what's going on around them, and reasonably so. But terrorism 2/3 of the time, that language really is predictive of accusing Russia of using terrorist tactics. And the use of fascism 5 times out of 6 is predictive, or the dictionary that we use of fascist synonyms in the Slavic counterparts is predictive of what people believe on the other side. If I can make these kind of inferences with computers, I promise you a lot of other people can too. This was done on a shoestring budget with a very, very hardworking group of very poorly paid Ukrainians, and myself and one graduate student at UCSD. This is a kind of data, like the ability to make inferences about what people are thinking out there. This would have been truly science fiction 30 years ago. We would have to rely on surveys, and like people lie to survey enumerators. It's really different when you think about data being generated in a spontaneous way even if they're narcissistic speech acts, they're still speech acts, and we can use them to make inferences about public opinion. And Ukraine is an interesting frontier in that. So in one sense, everything's really new. In another sense, everything is really depressingly old. And that's just kind of what I wanted to end with, is that if narrative tracks are obviously not news to anyone who lived through the ideological wars of the last century. They're probably not really news to anyone who's read even a little bit of George Orwell. The idea of using propaganda is not, and trying to manipulate people's memories is not. It's not like this hasn't been studied. It's not like I have any particularly deep insights on this. The only thing that's there to be noticed is that now it's happening in a much more decentralized way, and people can spread images around faster than before. Words and images, but especially images, can just go viral in a way that doesn't have a historical analog. Before, states had to be the ones that spread images. Now it's people. So that's kind of cool. Anyway, on to questions.